The first cold of October had come in the night, and by the time the burial was done, the ground held the chill of stone. The churchyard at Ashbourne lay along the western edge of the estate, separated from the park by a low wall of grey limestone that had stood there since the reign of the second George. The oaks along the wall had shed half their leaves in the night wind, and they lay in brown and amber heaps against the stone, and the morning sky was the particular flat grey of English October that promises nothing pleasant but delivers the day regardless. Cecily Hart had stood on the far side of that wall and watched the whole of it, the vicar, the handful of household staff permitted to attend, the plain wooden box with the brass plate that bore her aunt's name and the dates of her years, which were many, and the words of her service, which had been faithful. She had not wept during the service. She had held herself very still, the way her aunt had taught her to hold herself in the presence of people who were watching, and she had breathed through the cold morning air and thought of her aunt's hands, which were never idle, and of her aunt's voice, which had never been unkind to her. When the box was lowered, she had pressed one hand flat against the cold limestone of the wall to steady herself. And then it was done, and the household staff dispersed in small, quiet clusters back toward the house, and Cecily was alone. She had turned to go. She did not go. Something held her at the wall's edge. Some unwillingness to leave this place while the earth was still fresh, and she stood there for another minute, looking at the small mound and the thin wooden cross that would stand until the stone was carved. And it was in that minute that she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind the churchyard wall. She did not turn. She assumed a servant. She assumed any of a dozen ordinary presences this estate might produce in an ordinary morning. The footsteps stopped at the grave, and then there was silence, and in that silence she turned, because something in the quality of the silence required it, and she saw the Marquis of Ashbourne standing alone at her aunt's graveside, with his hat removed, and his dark head bowed, and his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the October wind. He wept. Not extravagantly. Not with any of the performances she had seen attributed to public mourning in the drawing rooms her mother had once frequented. He stood without moving, and the tears came down his face in two slow parallel lines, and he made no sound at all, and his expression was the expression of a man who had lost something he had no name for because he had never expected to have it in the first place. England's most feared lord stood alone at a housekeeper's grave and wept, and Cecily, who had come to Ashbourne to collect her aunt's few possessions and return to her small life in Northamptonshire, was the only person in the world who saw him do it. She turned away quickly. She pressed her back against the limestone and stared at the bare October sky, and understood, in a way she had not understood that morning, that she was going to need a great deal more time before she could leave this place. She stood there for 5 full minutes. She listened to the gravel settle and the wind move through the bare oaks and the distant sound of the stable yard going about its morning business, and she kept her eyes on the sky and thought very carefully about nothing at all, because the alternative was to think about what she had just seen, and she was not ready for that. A man like Edmund Calder did not weep in churchyards. That was what everyone said of him, and she had heard it said many times, because her aunt's letters had not been the only accounts of the Marquis of Ashbourne that circulated in the world she moved through. He had a reputation that preceded him into every room, and arrived some minutes before he did. She had heard him described as merciless, as severe, as the last man in England whose good opinion anyone would wish to court, because it was so rarely given and so formidably withheld. She had heard it said that he had ruined a man of business who had attempted to deceive him in a land purchase, ruined him thoroughly and without apparent regret. She had heard that he spoke rarely at dinner and never at balls, and that when he did speak, people listened with the attentiveness of those who understood that the words were limited and not likely to be repeated. None of that was wrong. She suspected none of it was wrong. But a man who had stood alone at her aunt's grave and wept without witness, without any audience at all, without the slightest concession to being observed, could not be only that. She pushed herself off the limestone wall at last and walked back toward the house. Cecily had received the letter 3 weeks before, delivered to her rented rooms in Northampton by a steward whose manner suggested he had performed this errand with some reluctance. Mrs. Martha Hart, formerly head housekeeper at Ashbourne Park in Derbyshire, had died quietly in her sleep in the 7th week of September, aged 71 years. The letter was brief and correct, and signed by a Mr. Grover, who was apparently the estate's man of business. It informed Miss Hart that her aunt had named her the sole recipient of her personal effects, and that those effects might be collected at her earliest convenience, and that accommodation at the park would be made available to her for no more than 2 nights. 2 nights had been offered. Cecily had required 3 days, because the journey from Northampton in October on a hired coach took the better part of 2 full days, and she had arrived the evening before, the burial pale with cold and stiff from the road, and a maid she did not recognize had brought her supper in a small room off the kitchen passage, and said very little. She had sat with her supper going cold, and looked at the walls of the small room, which were whitewashed and bare, and she had thought about her aunt, who had lived in this house for 40 years, and had apparently occupied rather better quarters than this, but who had nonetheless arranged for her niece to be placed here, as though anticipating that the household would manage her at the appropriate level of consideration. Her aunt had understood households. She had understood them precisely. She had not met Lord Ashbourne. She had not expected to meet Lord Ashbourne. Men of his station did not generally arrange to meet the relatives of their deceased housekeepers. She had understood, from the letter and from the manner of the household staff she encountered, that she was here on sufferance, that she would be managed with correct efficiency and then dispatched, and she had accepted this as the natural order of things. It was the natural order of things. Her aunt had served this household for 40 years, and the household would extend courtesy to her niece in the form of 2 nights' accommodation and a plain supper, and that would be the whole of their acquaintance. Her aunt had told her something different. In the letters that had arrived every month for as long as Cecily could remember, Martha Hart had described Ashbourne with a specificity that belonged to a place she loved. Not the house itself, though the house was magnificent, she wrote, and the library was the finest she had ever seen, and the kitchen garden in June was an argument for Providence. What she described were small things. The way the light came through the east windows in winter, the particular sound of the gravel walk in wet weather, the children of the kitchen staff who played near the walled garden in the afternoons. And she had described, in ways that were careful and never boastful and always slightly oblique, a man she had watched grow up. She had never called him by his title in her letters. She had called him Edmund. This had struck Cecily as singular. She had asked about it once, in a letter, and her aunt's reply had taken 3 weeks, and had said only that he was 6 years old when she came to that house. Some things did not require a title. Cecily had understood then, in the way one understands things one is not meant to fully grasp, that her aunt had been something more than a housekeeper to the household at Ashbourne. What that something more consisted of was not given to her. She had placed the letter with the others, and returned to her ordinary life, and thought no more about it. She thought about it now. She pushed herself off the limestone wall and walked back toward the house along the kitchen path, her hands cold inside her gloves, the thin soles of her traveling shoes already damp from the frosted grass. She did not look back at the churchyard. She thought about a man who wept at a housekeeper's grave and made no sound at all. And she thought about her aunt's letters. And she thought about what it meant that a man of his position had been the only other person at that grave on that October morning. And she thought that she was perhaps not going to be able to leave in 2 nights after all. She was correct about that. She could not have anticipated why. The estate's senior parlor maid, a small woman named Agnes, who had been at Ashbourne for 11 years and who had been assigned to manage Cecily's brief visit, was waiting in the kitchen passage with an expression that suggested she had been told something she did not entirely approve of. "His lordship's compliments," Agnes said, and her voice was perfectly even. "And Miss Hart is welcome to remain at the park until her aunt's effects have been properly sorted. He has extended the accommodation to a week." Cecily looked at her. "A week. That is what I was told to say." She did not know what to make of it. She thanked Agnes, who accepted this with a small nod, and led her to a considerably better room than the one she had occupied the night before. A room in the east wing with a window that looked onto the walled garden and a fire that had been laid and lit that morning. On the writing table, there was a note in a hand she did not recognize that said only that Mrs. Hart's effects were in the blue sitting room, and that she might take as much time as she required. It was not signed. She went to the blue sitting room that afternoon. Her aunt's effects were arranged on a round table near the window with a neatness that seemed deliberate, as though someone had laid them out carefully rather than simply piled them in a trunk. There were her aunt's best Sunday dress and the dark shawl she had worn to church. There was a Bible with a cracked spine and her name inside the cover in her own handwriting. There was a small cedar box that held 2 thimbles and a length of ribbon and 3 guineas in folded cloth. And there was the lace cap. Cecily picked up the lace cap and held it for a long time. She knew this cap. She had known it since childhood. It had been her aunt's best cap, the one she wore on occasions of importance, the one she had worn to Cecily's christening, or so she was told, and to the funerals of the 2 people she most loved, and on any morning she wished to face the world with a particular kind of composure. It was old and soft, and smelled faintly of the lavender water her aunt had used for as long as Cecily had been alive. She folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her gown, and began the work of going through the rest. It was in that room, an hour later, that she first heard the word. Lady Constance Ashbourne had not been at the burial. She had sent a card of condolence to the household staff through her own lady's maid, which Cecily had been told was the appropriate gesture for a woman of her position, and which suggested a woman who understood the proper hierarchy of grief as clearly as she understood everything else. Lady Constance was Lord Ashbourne's aunt by marriage, the sister of the late Marchioness, and she had remained at Ashbourne after her sister's death as the natural presiding figure of the household's social machinery. She was in her late 50s, erect and decided, with the air of a woman whose opinions had rarely been challenged and who had organized her life accordingly. She came into the corridor outside the blue sitting room with her companion, a Mrs. Linden, and she spoke clearly enough that her words arrived through the half-open door without effort. "The housekeeper's niece," she said, "has been extended a week's accommodation, apparently. I find it excessive. We must see she is made comfortable and dispatched quickly. She has no business lingering in the East Wing." Mrs. Linden said something too low for Cecily to hear. "It is sentiment," Lady Constance said. "Edmund is given to sentiment in this particular matter, and always has been. One indulges it to a degree, and then one acts practically. See to it that the steward speaks to her tomorrow. I want her gone by the end of the week." The footsteps moved away. Cecily remained in the blue sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the house resume its quiet around her. She thought about her aunt's letters. She thought about the word lingering and what it implied about her presence. She thought about a man in a churchyard that morning, standing alone with his hat in his hands, and she thought, whatever he is to this house, he was something to her, and she knew it before I did. She went to dinner that evening because the maid set a place for her, and there seemed to be no graceful way to refuse it. And she sat at the lower end of the long table in the lesser dining room, where the household staff took their meals, and she ate without speaking much. And the next morning she rose early and dressed and went outside into the kitchen garden with a stick, because a small boy named Thomas was sitting on a stone and crying because he could not make his letters. And Cecily could not walk past a crying child. She sat down on the wall beside him and smoothed a patch of dirt with her boot, and said, "Come here, then. Let us try another way." She did not know, in the 7 minutes that followed, that anyone was watching. She used a story about a bird that needed to write letters home to explain where it had flown to, and why each letter was shaped the way it was shaped, and why the letter T was a tree, and the letter S was the shape the snake made on a stone in warm weather. And Thomas stopped crying and began to draw in the dirt with great seriousness, and a second child, a girl of about 7 named Bess, drifted over from the gate and sat down in the dirt without being invited, and began to watch with the alert interest of someone who has been waiting for precisely this without knowing it. When Thomas formed his first recognizable letter A, Cecily's own face did something it had not done since she arrived at Ashbourne. She smiled without intending to. She did not see the man on the gravel walk above the garden wall, who had come out through the library door into the cold morning air to be alone for a while, and who had stopped. He had stopped because there was a woman in the kitchen garden he did not recognize, and she was crouching in the frost-stiff grass with a stick in her hand and 2 of the kitchen children beside her, and she was telling them something about a bird. He could not hear the words precisely. He could hear the shape of them, the patient particular cadence of someone who has explained a difficult thing many times and has not yet lost faith in explanation. He had not heard that cadence since he was 8 years old. He stood very still and watched. He watched her trace a letter in the dirt, and the boy trace it after her, badly, and her face not change at all in response to the error, except to show the boy a correction so small and specific it could not be mistaken for anything but confidence in him. He watched the girl arrive and sit down uninvited, and he watched the woman shift slightly to include her without remark, without pause, as though the girl's arrival had been expected. He stood there for longer than he intended. Then he went back inside and stood in the library for a moment before he sat down, and he looked at the room as though seeing it for the first time, which was foolish, because he had spent more time in this room than anywhere else in his life. She did not see him turn and go back inside, and she did not see what his face looked like when he went. She found out that he had been there only because Agnes told her, 3 days later, that his lordship had engaged a schoolroom tutor for the kitchen children to attend twice weekly beginning in November. Agnes said it with such deliberate neutrality that Cecily understood immediately she was meant to understand something. She thanked her and said nothing else. She thought about it for the rest of the day. On the 5th day of her stay at Ashbourne, she went to the library to return a volume of her aunt's that she had found among the effects. It was a thin book of collected verse, very old, with the margins marked in what she recognized as a child's handwriting. She had not looked at those marginal notes closely enough to read them. She had not felt she had the right. The library door was open. She knocked anyway, because the room was not empty. Edmund Calder, Marquis of Ashbourne, was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, and he turned when she knocked. And for a moment, neither of them moved. She had seen him only from a distance, at the churchyard where she had turned away, and twice in the corridors of the house, where he had given no sign of having noticed her. Up close he was exactly what his reputation suggested, which was to say that his face was grave and still, and offered nothing by way of welcome. He was tall and dark-haired, and the line of his jaw was tight even in repose, as though he had spent so long holding himself in reserve that it had become structural. His eyes were the color of deep water. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was level. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I came to return a book that belonged to my aunt. I was told the library was appropriate for that purpose." He looked at the volume in her hands. Something crossed his face, very quickly, and was gone. "Come in," he said. She came in and placed the book on the nearest table and prepared to leave. "The margins," he said. "Did you read them?" She stopped. She became aware in the silence of how large the library was and how still, and how the light came in through the tall east windows exactly as her aunt had described it, low and gold in the late afternoon, running in long bars across the floor. "I did not feel it was my place to," she said. He crossed to the table and picked up the book and stood with it for a moment. The lamplight caught the lines at the corners of his eyes, and the slight silver at his temples, and the steadiness of his hands, which had never trembled in public, which she suspected had not trembled in private either for a very long time. "I was 7, he said, "when she first brought me here. I could not read. Not a word. My tutors had given up on me 3 months prior." He opened the cover with the particular deliberateness of a man handling something fragile. "She brought me to this room every evening after supper for 2 years. She never raised her voice. She never showed impatience. She brought a lamp and set it on that table, the round one by the second window, and she sat opposite me, and we went through the letters one at a time, and she never once suggested that any difficulty I encountered was something other than temporary." He closed the book again. "I was 8.5 years old before I read my first full sentence aloud, and when I did, she clapped her hands once, quietly, and said, 'There it is,' and went back to her chair and picked up her own mending. He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved once across the cover of the book. 'She was the only person,' he said, and stopped. The sentence did not need to be finished. Cecily understood exactly what it would have said. Her throat closed. She understood what he meant. She had understood it the moment he began, in the way you understand something that corresponds to a knowledge you already carried, but had not yet found the words for. Her aunt had never told her this story directly. She had told her only the edges of it, the oblique impressions, the shape of a thing too important to be rendered plainly. The letters had been full of small devotions, the sound of particular rooms, the way certain light fell at certain hours, the patience required by certain kinds of work. She had never said that she had loved a child and watched him become a man, and that he was the reason she stayed. She had never said it directly. She had said everything except that, for 40 years. This was the center of it. "She spoke of you," Cecily said carefully. "In her letters. Not often. Not specifically. She spoke of you." He looked at her then, properly, with a directness that was not cold, which surprised her. "What did she say?" Cecily thought for a moment about truth and its costs. "She said you had done her proud," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She would say that." And it was not a dismissal. It was something else entirely. She left him standing in the library with the book in his hands. She walked back to her room in the east wing and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the garden and understood, with an accuracy that made her breath unsteady, that she was in a great deal of difficulty. The difficulty was not simple. It was not the simple difficulty of having discovered that a man she had been prepared to consider only from a respectful distance was in fact a man of genuine feeling. That alone she could have managed. The difficulty was that she had been at Ashbourne for 5 days, and in those 5 days she had found herself attentive to things she had no business attending to. The light that came through the library windows, the quality of silence in the corridors in the early morning before the household woke, the sound of his boots on the stone floor of the entrance hall, which was not like other boots in the house, being neither hurried nor reluctant, but simply precise. She had begun, without intending to notice when he was in a room she was about to enter, and to notice more acutely when he was not. This was dangerous. She was here for a week. Possibly less if Lady Constance had anything to say about it. She had a small rented room in Northampton and a position as a reading teacher to the daughters of 3 local families, and that was her life, and it was sufficient. And it was not this. She thought about the lace cap in her pocket. She thought about her aunt sitting opposite a 7-year-old boy with a lamp between them, going through the letters one at a time, every evening, for 2 years, staying because something in the work required staying. She put her hand over the pocket where the cap rested and sat there until the light went. If you have been listening to this story, and you feel the weight of what she understood in that chair, please do stay close. What comes next is harder, and quieter, and more costly. It was 3 evenings later that Lady Constance acted. The house party had arrived over the previous 2 days. 6 guests, among them a Mrs. Frome and her daughter Arabella, who was 22 and beautifully appointed, and had been brought to Ashbourne for reasons so transparent that even the kitchen staff had discussed them. Arabella Frome was polished and composed, and wore her dresses in the colors of winter sky, and she moved through the house with the ease of someone who had been told all her life that rooms like this were meant for her. She was not unkind. Cecily had watched her from the corridor one afternoon and decided that much was true. She was not a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who had been correctly positioned her entire life and did not know what the view looked like from any other angle. The evening before Lady Constance called her to the drawing-room, Cecily had passed the dining-room door at the hour when the guests assembled before dinner, and she had heard Mrs. Frome's voice quite clearly. "I cannot imagine why the housekeeper's niece is still at the house," Mrs. Frome said to the woman beside her, whom Cecily could not see. "Constance really ought to have better control of her household. One understands grief, naturally. One does not understand indefinite inconvenience." The other woman said something low and agreeing. "It invites confusion," Mrs. Frome said more quietly. Cecily had walked on. She had kept her face arranged and her pace steady, and she had gone back to the east wing and sat on the edge of her bed and thought very carefully about what she was and was not permitted to feel. She was not permitted to feel insulted. She had no standing in this house from which to take an insult. She was a guest on sufferance, a practical consequence of a death, and she had been treated with adequate courtesy, and that was all that was owed her. She understood this clearly. She was not permitted to feel hurt by his continued silence on the matter of her departure. He had extended her stay. He had read her aunt's books. He had told her something in the library that she suspected he had not told anyone. None of this constituted a claim or a hope, and she was not a foolish woman, and she did not permit herself to believe it did. What she permitted herself to feel was a grief that was clean and specific. She did not want to leave this house, and she was going to have to leave it, and that was simply the shape of things. She was correct about that. The question was only how it would happen. Cecily had tried to remain invisible. She had taken her meals early or late. She had kept to the east wing and the kitchen garden and the churchyard, where she went each evening to sit by her aunt's grave with the question of departure growing heavier in her each time. She had extended her stay twice already. She could not extend it again. But Lady Constance did not wait for her to leave on her own. Cecily was brought to the drawing room that evening by a maid who said only that her ladyship wished to see her, and she knew from the maid's face that this was not going to be the kind of conversation she could refuse or forestall. The drawing room held 9 people, including Lord Ashbourne, who was standing at the far window with his back to the room as she entered. Lady Constance sat in the chair nearest the fire in a gown of deep amber, and Mrs. Frome sat at her right hand, and Arabella sat opposite, and the other guests arranged themselves in the manner of people who understood that something was about to occur. "Miss Hart," Lady Constance said, and her voice was warm and careful in the way of a woman who is being observed by people whose opinion she values. "How kind of you to come. I have been remiss in welcoming you properly. Please, sit down." Cecily sat. "I understand your aunt's effects have been sorted," Lady Constance said. "That must be a relief. It is never a comfortable matter, going through what a person has left behind." She set down her tea. "I have taken the liberty of consulting with a most respectable family in Derby who are in need of a gentlewoman as a companion for their eldest daughter. The position is appropriate to your situation, and the salary is generous. I have written on your behalf already, and they have expressed enthusiasm." She smiled pleasantly. "A carriage can be arranged for tomorrow morning. You will be in Derby by evening, and the family expects you by the end of the week." The room was very quiet. Cecily looked at her. She did not look at Lord Ashbourne. "I see," she said. "We are all grateful for your patience during this time," Lady Constance continued. "It is never easy to be far from home in such circumstances, and of course the housekeeper's niece has been shown every kindness the house can offer. Mr. Grover has a small sum arranged for you, for the journey." She said it as a courtesy. She said it as a conclusion. Cecily became aware, in the particular way one becomes aware of things one has been trying not to know, that she had placed her hand flat in her lap, and that her fingers were pressing hard into the wool of her gown, and that her aunt's lace cap was in the pocket of that gown, and that tomorrow morning a carriage would take her away from this house and its library and its walled garden and the grave with the thin wooden cross, and she would become a companion in Derby, and she would not think about any of this again. She looked at Lord Ashbourne's back. He had not moved. He did not move now. Something in her went very still. "Thank you," she said to Lady Constance. "That is most kind." She folded her hands together. "I will be ready in the morning." She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She looked at the trunk that had stood against the east wall since she arrived, which she had half unpacked on the second day, and had not touched since. The trunk that held her 2 good dresses and her winter shawl and her father's copy of Cowper's poems and the small tin of writing paper she had brought in case she needed to correspond. A week ago, she had assumed she would be gone before any of it mattered. That assumption had shifted, without her quite deciding it, across the days of the library and the kitchen garden and the grave and the lamp on the round table by the second window. She thought about his silence in the drawing room, the way he had stood at the far window with his back to her. He had not turned around when she came in. He had not turned around when Lady Constance laid out the arrangement. He had not turned around when Cecily accepted it. She had watched his back the entire time, that particular kind of stillness that she had come to recognize, and she had told herself it meant nothing, and she believed it still. She thought about what her aunt had said in the only letter that had ever approached this subject directly, written the winter before last and now in Cecily's memory, which had said, "A man who holds himself very still is not a man who feels nothing." He is a man who has learned that moving costs him. Her aunt had meant it generally. She was almost certain her aunt had meant it generally. She thought about his voice saying she was the only person, and stopping. The careful way he held that sentence. The particular care of a man who has been speaking carefully his entire life, because if he speaks carelessly, someone will take the words and do something with them he did not intend. She took out the writing paper from the table and lit the candle and sat for a long moment without moving. Then she wrote. She wrote about Martha. She wrote about the letters that had come every month for as long as she could remember, and what was in them, and what was not. She wrote about the oblique pride her aunt had carried in the way she described a house and a man, and 40 years of a life lived in service to both. She wrote about what kind of woman chose to stay for 40 years in a place she could have left, and what that choosing required. She wrote about a woman whose wisdom was not announced, only demonstrated, whose patience was not performed, but simply exercised again and again on cold mornings and at difficult hours, on children who could not yet read and adults who had forgotten how to be kind. She wrote that she had come to Ashbourne expecting to find a house, and had found instead a record of someone she thought she knew, written in rooms she had only heard described. She wrote that she understood, in reading it, that her aunt had known him in ways she never would, and that she had chosen to know him, and that in her understanding, he was a man who merited choosing. She wrote one sentence near the end. She said, "You were the best of men, though you had not yet been shown how." She sealed the letter and wrote his name on the outside and called for the night footman and asked him to deliver it in the morning. Then she folded the lace cap and placed it on the writing table where she could see it. It lay in the candlelight, looking like what it was, which was an old woman's best hat, worn at the edges, soft with use, smelling of 40 years of lavender water, and a life devoted entirely to particular things. Cecily looked at it for a long time. Then she went to sleep. She was in the entrance hall at 6:30, dressed for travel, her single small trunk by the door, when she heard his boots on the marble floor. The hall was not empty. Lady Constance had risen early, which Cecily suspected was not accidental. Mrs. Frome stood with her, and 2 of the other guests who had come down for the morning's hunting stood near the outer door with their coats and gloves. The steward was there. The footman who had been assigned to load her trunk stood at attention. It was, in sum, an audience sufficient for whatever happened next. Lord Ashbourne crossed the hall in 3 strides. He was holding a letter. Her letter. The seal had been broken. He had read it. He stopped in front of her, and the hall went very quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that occurs when a group of people understand simultaneously that they are witnessing something they will describe for years. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was not the face she had first seen in the corridors of this house, closed and still and offering nothing. It was the face she had seen, briefly, in the library, when his thumb had moved across the cover of the book. It was a face that had decided something. Then he unfolded the letter and found the line and read it aloud. She said you were the best of men, though you had not yet been shown how. He refolded it. He held it in one hand. The hall was absolutely silent. Near the fireplace, Lady Constance's fan had gone still. Mrs. Frome stood with her glove half drawn and did not finish drawing it. Miss Cecily Hart is not leaving this house today, he said. It was 11 words, spoken level and without drama, in the same voice he had used in the library. It carried no flourish. It did not require any. Lady Constance had gone very still near the fireplace. A rearrangement was occurring behind her composed expression, the visible process of a woman recalculating what has happened and what it means, and what, if anything, can now be done about it. Cecily watched her for just a moment and thought that she was not wrong exactly. She was only wrong about this. He extended his right hand to Cecily. His face, which had spent its entire public life in careful reserve, was entirely clear. "I should like," he said quietly, "to show you the rest of the library, if you are willing." She was aware of the room around them. She was aware of Mrs. Frome's hand going still on her glove, of the steward looking at the floor, of Lady Constance seated very upright with the air of a woman who has miscalculated and knows it and is too composed to show anything else. She was aware, more acutely than any of that, of her own heart, which was doing something it had not been invited to do, which was to proceed past the careful measurement she had imposed on the last 8 days, and simply believe what was in front of her. She was aware of his hand extended and his face open in a way she had seen only in glimpses, in the library, in the gravel walk, and once, at a grave in October, when he had not known anyone was watching. She took his hand. It was warm. It was entirely steady. His fingers closed around hers with a care that was not hesitation and not ceremony, but something exactly between them. The held breath of a person who has been very careful for a very long time and is only now deciding to stop. "Yes," she said. "I think I would like that." She felt it in her wrist first, that steadiness, and then in her chest, the release of something she had been holding compressed for 8 days, the particular relief of a held thing finally given leave to breathe. There is more that must be said of what followed, but most of it belongs to the two of them, and some of it was not witnessed, and the rest was witnessed only by the house itself, which had been watching him for 35 years and knew his face better than any ballroom did. It may be enough to say that Lady Constance retained her position in the household, but did not again arrange anyone's departure without being asked. That Arabella Frome, who was not a cruel woman, wrote to a friend shortly afterward that she had been slightly in love with the Marquis of Ashbourne for a season and a half, and was not at all sorry to discover he was entirely unavailable, as she had always suspected that the labor of thawing him would have been considerable. That the library at Ashbourne was reorganized that winter, and that certain books were moved to a lower shelf, where the children of the kitchen staff could reach them. And that on a morning in early March, when the frost had just begun to leave the ground, and the bare trees in the churchyard were showing the first faint green of new growth, Cecily and Edmund stood side by side at a small grave. He placed a bunch of winter jasmine at the base of the stone, which was new and cut with her name and her years, and the simple words, "faithful in all things." The flowers were pale yellow against the gray stone, and they were already slightly cold. He stood with his hat in his hands, as he had stood on the October morning she had first seen him. She put her hand into her pocket and took out the lace cap, which she had carried every day since her aunt died, which she had carried out of the east wing and through the entrance hall and into the library and through all the weeks that came after. She held it lightly. They did not speak for a long time. The March wind moved through the bare branches, and the rooks called from the far end of the churchyard wall, and the light on the stone was the thin particular light of early English spring, which is not warm yet, but is no longer cold. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him, and his fingers closed around hers exactly as they had in the entrance hall, steady and deliberate and without ceremony, as though this was something that had already been decided a long time ago by someone who had loved them both and known them neither. They walked home together through the bare trees. "Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Martha Hart and the world she tended moved you, leave a word below. It means everything.